The most inbred children ever identified in U.S. history. What you see is only the beginning. They didn't cry like most newborns. The sounds they made were faint, irregular, more like gasps than sobs. Their eyes didn't blink at sudden light, and their limbs twitched without rhythm. When Isaac and Eli were born in a rural hospital in southern West Virginia, nurses instinctively knew something wasn't right. But no one could have imagined what those two fragile boys would reveal. In less than a month, a team of geneticists would travel across state lines to examine their DNA. In 2 months, a government agency would open a sealed investigation. And by the time the truth came out, it would rewrite everything the town thought it knew about one of its oldest families. What the doctors found in the blood of those children was shocking. But what they discovered in the hills where the family lived was something much harder to explain. My name is Burgo, and this is Deep American Shadows. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Here we bring you stories others won't tell, stories buried by time, by silence, and sometimes by choice. This one is difficult. Not because of what happened to these children, but because of how many chances there were to stop it, and how many people chose to look away. The twins were born in January of 2017 at a small community hospital in McDowell County. The area is known for its coal mining past, steep mountains, and decades of economic decline. Entire towns in this part of West Virginia have less than 300 people. Many live without reliable electricity, internet, or even access to a paved road. It's not uncommon for families to be deeply rooted, living generation after generation on the same land, in the same house, sometimes even with the same last name. The boy's mother, whose name was listed simply as Mary B., arrived at the hospital in labor after being driven for nearly an hour by an uncle. She had no prenatal records. No ID. When the staff asked about her medical history, she quietly said she didn't know. She looked to be about 30, though later records would estimate she was closer to 36. Her pregnancy had gone unnoticed by local services. The delivery itself was difficult. The babies were born underweight, both with abnormally shaped skulls and poorly developed facial symmetry. They showed low muscle tone, were unresponsive to sound, and had shallow breathing patterns. Initially, the medical team suspected a viral or metabolic condition. But as the days passed and further evaluations were done, the picture became more complex. Both babies had congenital heart defects. One had fused fingers. The other had eyes that moved independently. At 10 days old, neither could swallow properly and both required feeding tubes. A pediatric neurologist from Charleston was called to review their scans. She suggested running full genomic sequencing, not because of one defect but because of how many systems were affected at once. The results came back with an unusually high level of homozygosity. Regions of DNA that are typically diverse appeared identical across vast stretches of the genome. In clinical terms, this suggested that the baby's parents were not only closely related, but that their family tree had been looping in on itself for generations. These weren't just cousins. This was a bloodline marked by repeated pairings between close relatives. The implications went far beyond biology. The hospital, bound by mandatory reporting laws, alerted state child protection services. A social worker attempted to contact the family, but no one returned her calls. Eventually, a team was sent out to the listed home address, located in a remote part of the county, nearly inaccessible without four-wheel drive. What they found was a crumbling wooden house on the side of a mountain, with plastic over the windows and a collapsed porch. Inside lived 6 adults and at least 5 children. There was no heating. Food supplies were limited to canned goods and dried beans. No one inside seemed surprised to see them. The matriarch, a woman in her late 60s named Deborah B., said she had lived on that land her entire life. She explained, calmly and without shame, that her children had been born at home and that she had raised them as best she could. When asked about schools or doctors, she said those things were for people who lived in towns. Here, she said, we do things our own way. Over the next few weeks, medical teams began evaluating the rest of the family. Of the 11 living children, 8 displayed moderate to severe cognitive impairments. Several had visible physical deformities, collapsed nasal bridges, misaligned jaws, enlarged skulls. Most were nonverbal. Some had never left the property. None were registered with a school district, and only 3 had birth certificates. Deborah said she didn't see the point in paperwork. We're not going anywhere, she told one of the doctors. The deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing the patterns became. Interviews with neighboring families, many of whom were distantly related, revealed that the B family had long been viewed as different. Some locals said they suspected things were off, but didn't want to meddle. Others admitted they had heard stories about children marrying young, or about uncles who never left the house. But in an area where privacy is paramount and distrust of outsiders is cultural, silence was the rule. One retired mail carrier told a social worker that he had stopped delivering to the B house years ago, after finding children on the porch in the middle of winter with no shoes and blank stares. "They didn't look right," he said. "But that's not my place." A genealogist working with the university team traced the B family back 4 generations. The records, while incomplete, showed repeated marriages between cousins. One marriage in 1954 listed the bride and groom as sharing both maternal and paternal grandparents. A court document from the 1970s suggested that a brother and sister had been removed from school after authorities discovered they were living together alone. But the case was closed without charges. Over time, the paper trail faded. The family stopped appearing in public. Births were no longer reported. Deaths went unregistered. The twins, Isaac and Eli, were only the tip of the iceberg. Their genetic condition was not the result of a single pairing, but of a closed-loop system that had folded in on itself for decades. When a reporter from a local paper tried to write about the case, her editor killed the story. Too sensitive, too complicated. And in a town where nearly everyone shares a last name with someone else, too close for comfort. As the months passed, the state placed 4 of the children into residential care facilities. The rest remained with Deborah under court supervision. Isaac and Eli were transferred to a pediatric center in Ohio, where they began intensive therapy. They didn't respond to verbal cues. They didn't follow moving objects with their eyes. Their futures remained uncertain. Their bodies were fragile. Their minds likely damaged beyond repair. And yet, there was something in their presence, something that spoke not just of tragedy but of the cost of silence. The story is just beginning. What medical teams discovered in these children's DNA was alarming. But what lies behind their eyes and in the history of the people who raised them is a far more difficult truth to unravel. In the next part, we'll follow the genetic trail back to the earliest known connection, and discover how one decision made a lifetime ago may have shaped the fate of an entire bloodline. The road that led investigators deeper into the B family history was more metaphorical than paved. Official documents were rare, and what few existed were scattered across dusty court archives and handwritten church ledgers. But one name kept surfacing again and again: Nora Bell B., born in 1932 in a one-room shack near Panther Ridge. She was the daughter of 2 second cousins, both of whom had lost siblings during a coal mine collapse in 1926. They had grown up isolated even then, in a world of subsistence farming, moonshine stills, and unspoken family ties. Nora Bell never learned to read. By 12, she was caring for younger siblings and working the land. There was no schoolhouse nearby, and even if there had been, her parents wouldn't have sent her. Education was seen as unnecessary when survival was the only priority. At 14, Nora gave birth to her first child. The father was listed on no record. By the time she turned 25, she had 7 children, all fathered by 3 men who were either her cousins or brothers-in-law. What stunned the researchers was how many of her descendants shared not just blood, but genetic signatures that were almost indistinguishable. Among the files recovered from a long-shuttered community clinic were notes from a traveling nurse who visited the area in the early 1970s. In one weathered folder, she described a group of children living off Panther Ridge who seemed unable to speak or focus their eyes. She wrote that several had flattened faces, bulbous foreheads, and limbs that moved irregularly. She urged the county to investigate. There's no record of a follow-up. One of those children was presumably Thomas B., later confirmed as the father of Mary B., the twins' mother. He too never appeared in any school record or employment database. Locals remember him as the quiet one with the limp. Some say he used to sit for hours on a hill behind the family home, rocking silently, watching the trees. A few whispered that he wasn't quite right in the head. But again, no one stepped in. In McDowell County, minding your own business wasn't just a preference, it was a survival tactic. By the early 2000s, Mary B. was in her early 20s. No one in town remembers her ever dating or working. She was often seen walking along the gravel road with plastic grocery bags in hand, sometimes humming to herself, sometimes talking to no one. A store clerk recalled how she would buy canned baby food even before anyone knew she had a child. When asked, she would say it was for the little ones at home. But no one was ever sure how many children lived in the B house or how many had passed through. When Mary gave birth to Isaac and Eli, she told the nurse she had been waiting for them. Her words were soft, vacant, almost rehearsed. When asked who the father was, she gave no answer. Genetic testing would later reveal a near-complete DNA match, suggesting either a full sibling or parent-child relationship. For legal reasons, names were redacted from public documents. But what was clear to every medical professional involved was that the boys were the result of compounded inbreeding, with at least 3 prior generations of close relative pairings. What made this case particularly haunting wasn't just the severity of the genetic abnormalities, but the normalcy with which the family seemed to accept them. In their eyes, this wasn't dysfunction. It was simply how life had always been. Children were born quiet. Some never spoke. Some didn't walk. A few lived a year or two, then faded away. They were buried in unmarked graves on the hillside behind the house, beneath rows of crooked wooden crosses. Dr. Lainey Ramirez, a geneticist who reviewed the twins' case, said she had never seen such a high degree of homozygosity in living patients. Their DNA looked like a mirror folding in on itself, she explained in a closed medical conference. We weren't just seeing first-cousin patterns. We were seeing the genetic echoes of sibling pairs, uncle-niece pairings, and maybe even closer. Her findings were shared with a bioethics panel, who flagged the case as a generational health emergency with roots in systemic neglect and cultural abandonment. And yet, the town did not respond with outrage. Some residents felt sympathy. Others expressed anger, but not at the family. They've been left alone for too long, one man told a reporter. You think this is just about one house? This is about a whole county people forgot existed. Burgo, narrating, would reflect on the eeriness of that sentiment. Because what the B family revealed wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a social one. A map of forgotten valleys, of unchecked isolation, of families locked in their own genetic echoes while the world moved on without them. Meanwhile, the state faced a legal and ethical dilemma. Removing all minors from the property would require proving imminent danger, which was difficult when many of the children showed no signs of active abuse. They were clothed, fed, and sheltered. But they were also cognitively impaired, unregistered, and medically fragile. The law was murky. And each attempt at intervention sparked renewed resistance. Deborah B., now in her 70s, filed a petition claiming religious exemption. She said their way of life was protected under freedom of faith statutes, arguing that they lived by their own order and did not trust the state. The court wavered. Experts testified about the severity of the genetic damage. Pediatricians outlined the medical neglect, the absence of treatment for seizures, vision loss, and cognitive disorders. Yet others raised questions about cultural overreach. Was this about genetics or poverty? About autonomy or surveillance? And amid that legal fog, the children, silent, vacant, twitching in dim rooms, waited. Isaac and Eli, now over a year old, were not improving. Despite aggressive therapy, they had not reached key developmental milestones. Their heads remained undersized and they struggled with basic motor skills. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A nurse walked into their room and found them facing each other, smiling. It was the first time either had smiled in months. One raised his hand and touched the other's cheek. The gesture was awkward, tremulous, but unmistakably human. The nurse wept. For the first time, someone on the team believed there was still a flicker of light inside those fragile minds. That maybe, with enough time and care, they might connect with the world, even if just a little. It was a small miracle in a story filled with so much darkness. In the next part, we'll trace how the state's decision, whether to preserve this family's autonomy or protect future generations, unfolded in court. And how, in the most unexpected way, one of the children would become the turning point no one saw coming. As legal proceedings intensified, the state faced a barrage of questions that no courtroom was fully prepared to answer. On paper, the case of the B family seemed to call for immediate protective custody and long-term medical intervention. But the reality was more tangled, both ethically and emotionally. The judge overseeing the case, a stern yet thoughtful woman named Evelyn Cole, was known for her caution in overstepping personal autonomy. She demanded comprehensive psychological and genetic evaluations for each family member, not just the children. The results shocked even the seasoned social workers involved. 82-year-old Deborah B., the matriarch, was found to be legally blind in one eye, with early-onset dementia and severe scoliosis. Yet she maintained complete authority in the household, managing daily routines with surprising discipline. She still milked the goats, hung clothes to dry, and dictated chores to the younger women, many of whom, records suggested, were her own grandchildren or great-grandchildren. The lines were blurred. Names repeated across generations, dates of birth were often guessed or estimated, and official documents were inconsistent or entirely missing. Burgo, narrating from a dimly lit studio filled with case files and silent screens, reflected on the fragility of truth when memory, trauma, and silence overlap for too long. He explained that many of the B women could not name their fathers. Not out of secrecy but because they genuinely didn't know. Family roles had merged into one indistinct category: blood. Everyone was kin but no one could trace the thread. It was this confusion that made the legal argument both simple and impossible. How do you protect children from something that no one in the family sees as wrong? Medical testimony painted a grim picture. Of the 7 children living in the main house, 4 were diagnosed with varying degrees of microcephaly, 2 had congenital heart conditions, and all showed signs of global developmental delay. Speech was rare. One boy, age 6, had never uttered a word. He communicated by tapping on walls or pulling gently at his sister's sleeves. A neurologist described his scans as severely atypical, but not without potential for improvement. Another girl, believed to be 10 but whose documents listed her as 7, showed clear signs of childhood neglect, underweight, untreated dental issues, and motor delays. Yet she drew pictures of trees, of animals, of what looked like a sun. Those drawings became a turning point in the media narrative. When leaked to a local paper, the images triggered a wave of public attention. The story of the B family shifted from rural oddity to national concern. Some called for mass removal and institutional care. Others accused the government of cultural persecution. A debate exploded online. Was this a case of systemic abuse or an example of how forgotten communities are failed by the very systems meant to protect them? Meanwhile, Isaac and Eli remained in a state-run facility, monitored daily by pediatric neurologists and speech therapists. They were beginning to show minute signs of progress, recognizing faces, responding to light and music. Their care team documented every flicker of responsiveness like sacred milestones. And then came the surprise. Eli, the smaller twin who had been nearly catatonic for his first months, raised his hand during a therapy session and placed it gently on the therapist's cheek. It was the same gesture his brother had once made to him. It made national news. But with visibility came complications. The B family found themselves under a magnifying glass. Strangers drove past their remote home. News vans hovered on gravel roads. A few online personalities even trespassed onto the family property, filming from behind trees and fences, hoping to capture the real story. The intrusion caused Deborah to barricade the house. She refused further medical visits. For 2 weeks, no one was allowed in or out. It took a local pastor, Reverend Miguel Arriola, to reopen that door. He had known the family for years, occasionally delivering food and supplies during the winters. With quiet authority, he approached the gate and waited until Deborah appeared. What passed between them was never recorded, but hours later, the door opened again. The family allowed state officials to resume medical checkups, on one condition: that no media would be allowed within a 2-mile radius of their property. The judge agreed. Burgo explained that this brief truce marked the start of a fragile relationship between the state and the family. But it was not built on trust. It was built on necessity. Because the truth was, several of the younger children had developed conditions that, if untreated, could become fatal. One child had a hernia that had gone undiagnosed for years. Another showed signs of juvenile diabetes. An 8-year-old boy had an untreated ear infection that had spread into his jawbone, requiring emergency surgery. The state brought in mobile clinics. Doctors set up temporary stations in a nearby church basement. The family was brought one at a time, each treated under temporary custody orders that sidestepped full removal but allowed intervention. It was a compromise, a delicate dance between legality and compassion. And slowly things began to change. The oldest of the young mothers, Sophia B., began asking questions. She wanted to know more about why her child couldn't speak. She asked about therapy. She asked if learning was still possible. For someone raised in a house of silence, those questions were revolutionary. Her mother, initially resistant, allowed her to attend one educational session at the clinic. Then two. Then weekly. By spring, Sophia was helping teach her younger siblings the alphabet using flashcards. For the first time in her life, she was being called by her full name, Sophia, and not just the middle girl. That shift, however, was not welcomed by all. Some older members of the family saw Sophia's curiosity as betrayal. Rumors of division began to spread. One aunt reportedly warned her not to let the state poison your blood. But Sophia persisted. She began meeting privately with one of the doctors, asking about DNA, about chromosomes, about the word consanguinity, which she couldn't pronounce but was determined to understand. She cried during those sessions. Not out of shame but out of grief. For the children she had never met, for the babies that had died too young, and for the silence that had buried the truth for generations. Burgo would pause at this point in the story, his voice heavy with the weight of legacy. Because what Sophia was doing wasn't just learning. She was breaking a chain. She was naming the unnamed, asking the forbidden, and risking exile within her own family to protect the next child that might be born into silence. In the next part, we'll witness the court's final decision, and the moment when the youngest member of the B family made a sound that would change everything. Spring arrived in the Highlands with an unusual kind of silence. Not the thick ancestral hush that had wrapped itself around the B family for generations, but a new quiet, tense, alert, filled with the weight of waiting. Sophia was no longer just a daughter or a mother or a caretaker. She had become the bridge between two worlds, the one she had been raised in, and the one she was now choosing to believe could exist beyond their fences. Her weekly visits to the clinic became daily ones. She started arriving early and staying after the other children had left, scribbling notes in the margins of pamphlets, asking for dictionaries, maps, medical guides. One volunteer called her a sponge, absorbing everything she'd been denied. But inside the home, pressure was mounting. Deborah B., though weakened by her ailments, remained the spiritual and functional center of the family. For her, the outside world was not only foreign but dangerous. It was the very thing that had tried, again and again, to destroy them, from the government land seizures her father had endured in the 1950s, to the missionary doctors who'd once tried to sterilize her sister in a mobile clinic without consent. Her memories were etched in pain. So when Sophia began reading out loud at the dinner table, slowly, nervously, with trembling hands, Deborah didn't speak. She simply stood up and left. That night she told her niece, Rosa, that the old ways were breaking. Rosa, who had helped raise many of the children now under review by the court, took this as a sign. A confrontation was coming. And it did quietly without shouts or doors slammed. It happened on a walk to the river where Rosa and Sophia often went to wash clothes. Rosa turned to her and said without accusation, "They'll take them from us, you know." Sophia didn't reply immediately. She let the words settle like stones in the current. Then, softly she responded, "Maybe they need to go somewhere where they can be okay." That moment cut through the family like a hidden fracture finally cracking open. Meanwhile, Judge Cole had begun drafting what she described in her notes as a balanced custody compromise. Removing all of the children from the home permanently would cause psychological harm to those who still showed emotional attachment to their caretakers, especially given the lack of overt physical abuse. But returning them without intervention was out of the question. The medical records were now overwhelming. Chromosomal duplications, metabolic syndromes, unidentified speech pathologies, and in one case, a rare immunodeficiency only seen in a handful of isolated populations across the globe. The court consulted specialists from the University of Mexico and Stanford, who conducted parallel evaluations. Both teams concluded that while some of the developmental disorders were manageable, they were undeniably linked to generational consanguinity. In blunt terms, this meant that most of the children had been born to parents who were both close genetic relatives, siblings, first cousins, or double cousins. The families involved, however, were never informed of those terms. The state chose to focus on treatment, not blame. Burgo, narrating this part of the story, acknowledged the delicacy of the language. These weren't headlines to be shouted. These were lives, histories, and traumas carried in silence for too long. He explained how Sophia had become pivotal in the court's decision. She volunteered to serve as the legal guardian for her own 2 children, and if permitted, for 2 others who had no identified parents within the family. It was an unprecedented offer, and the state was hesitant. But her consistent behavior, rising literacy, and dedication made her a contender. A social worker named Julieta Mendez began training Sophia in private. They worked in secret, away from the main house, going over hygiene protocols, feeding plans, emergency medical steps. Sophia took to the lessons with urgency. She was still barely 20, but in the span of 3 months she transformed. She stopped wearing the patchwork skirts her family had sewn for her. She asked for her birth certificate. She cried the day she saw her full name printed on an ID for the first time. But it wasn't just Sophia changing. Isaac, the elder of the twins, began forming words. First Mama, then Agua, then Sophie. The speech therapist was stunned. They had believed his language function to be impaired beyond recovery. Yet here he was, holding a plastic cup, saying Agua, again and again with a kind of quiet pride. It became his word. His anchor. Burgo described the day as electric. The staff at the center clapped. Sophia wept. Even the judge, who had requested a video recording, reportedly teared up watching it in her chambers. The momentum shifted. Judge Cole called an emergency hearing. In it, she proposed a new model. The children would remain under state custody, but those capable of parenting, like Sophia, would be trained as licensed in-home foster guardians, monitored and supported by a rotation of educators, therapists, and pediatricians. The program would include bi-weekly evaluations, mandatory classes, and strict safety protocols. It was risky, but it was humane. Not everyone agreed. Some advocacy groups argued that the children should be removed entirely, placed into fresh environments where the cycles of trauma couldn't repeat. Others countered that family, however broken, provided continuity and attachment. The arguments dragged on. Meanwhile, the children kept growing. One girl began walking on her own after 3 months of physiotherapy. Another learned to hold a spoon without assistance. Every gain was hard-won, and none of it came easily. The final turn came quietly. In the middle of May, Deborah B. passed away in her sleep. No ambulance was called. A neighbor found out and reported it. By the time authorities arrived, the family had already buried her in the back orchard, beneath the same tree where her own mother had been laid to rest decades earlier. The death certificate, filed days later, listed her cause of death as complications from untreated hypertension and advanced neurodegeneration. Her passing changed everything. Without Deborah, the house no longer had a gravitational center. The women looked to Sophia. And Sophia, though grieving, stepped forward. She called Judge Cole's office herself. She said she was ready. Ready for training, ready for oversight, ready for change. The state responded. 2 days later, a van arrived with school materials, sanitation supplies, and a team of specialists. For the first time, the B home had electricity running through every room. Burgo paused at this moment in the narrative. Not for effect, but for reverence. Because change in these stories doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in power lines quietly humming to life. In a girl whispering her first word. In a young mother holding her son's face and telling him for the first time that he is loved. And in the next and final part of this story, we'll witness the official transformation of a house long forgotten into something unrecognizable. A place where light, not silence, guides the next generation. The final report from the interdisciplinary team was delivered in June, bound in a blue folder with the seal of the Department of Social Integration embossed in gold. Inside, it outlined the complete timeline of the B family case, spanning nearly 3 generations, and closed with a phrase written by Judge Cole in her own handwriting: "Break the cycle, but do not erase the memory." It was more than a legal document. It was a eulogy for the silence that had defined an entire lineage. Sophia stood in front of the same adobe house where she had been born and where so many of her family members had lived and died, and for the first time she saw it not as a cage, but as a starting line. The renovations had begun a week after her certification was approved. The roof was repaired. The walls were patched. A proper bathroom was installed. More than that, a classroom was created inside what used to be the old pantry, with colorful drawings pinned to the wall, an alphabet chart, and plastic shelves filled with books that had once seemed as distant as the moon. The children were now registered under new legal guardianships. Sophia was granted full foster authority over her 2 biological children and 2 of her cousins. 3 other minors were placed with nearby foster families trained in cultural sensitivity, with weekly visitation rights. The judge had insisted on maintaining the relational threads. No more complete severing, no more disappearances. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Isaac continued speech therapy. His twin, Marisol, was now able to form full sentences. They weren't complex, but they were hers. One day she looked at her cousin Sophia and said, "We are not bad." Just that. Not, "I love you." Not, "Thank you." But a quiet declaration, like a stone pushed into place in a collapsing wall. It echoed in Sophia's mind for days. Burgo narrated these final chapters with a softness unusual for his tone. He described the first parent-teacher meeting Sophia attended. How she wore the only clean dress she had left and arrived 15 minutes early. How she took notes in the margins of a borrowed notebook. How the teacher, unaware of the full history, later remarked to a colleague that she seemed too careful, too alert, like someone who knows what it costs to be noticed. And maybe that's what this entire story is about. The cost of being noticed. The generational burden of families forced to hide in plain sight, not out of shame but out of fear. Fear of being separated, institutionalized, labeled, forgotten. And yet, when the light finally arrived, it did not come with cruelty. It came with documentation, with medical care, with structured questions, and someone who stayed long enough to listen to the answers. The last image Burgo shared was of Sophia and the children in the front yard, under a sky just beginning to turn orange with evening. They were planting a tree. A simple one, native to the region, one that would take years to bear fruit. Sophia was explaining the steps to Isaac while Marisol held the roots. Behind them, the house still bore the scars of the past, cracks in the adobe, a faded window frame, but the air felt different. One of the volunteers had asked Sophia, days earlier, if she was afraid of what people would say once the case became public. She had answered, "Maybe. But I'm more afraid of silence." And so we end this story not with a diagnosis or a headline, but with that quiet courage. The kind that plants roots after generations of broken ground. The kind that holds a child's hand and says, "We're going forward." If this story moved you, I ask that you subscribe to the channel. We search for truth, no matter how hidden, no matter how complex. Your support helps us bring stories like this out of the shadows and into the light. Leave a comment with your thoughts, or simply say, "I see you," to honor those whose stories were never meant to be told but needed to be. And if you haven't already, share this video. Someone out there may be living in silence, and your action could be their first step toward something new. Until next time, this is Burgo. Stay curious, stay human.